let's first of all touch in with Catherine Philp, the World Affairs editor at The Times. Hello to you, Catherine. Welcome back.
Hi, John.
Catherine, always good to have you here. So, look, Zelensky, he didn't seem wildly optimistic ahead of that talk between Trump and Putin, and afterwards maybe not over-impressed. I wonder what we'll find out, whatever we do find out later on, about what went on between Trump and Zelensky in the last hour or so. But you wonder, what would Zelensky have gone into that conversation with Trump hoping to achieve?
I think for Zelensky, he probably went in, given the background to this and, given what had transpired between them before, probably went into it trying to appear very open to suggestions, possibly being firm, but on his red lines, but not, not sort of being aggressive about them or not putting down the process. I think he's going to have to play this very, very carefully.
Yes.
If you look at the readouts we got yesterday from that call between Trump and Putin and how far apart they were, the White House version of what transpired and then the Kremlin version of transpired. It'll be interesting to see what we get out of this Trump-Zelensky call. I think that Zelensky is probably going to be a bit more emollient than Trump, but he's likely to express his frustrations if he feels nothing's really come of this. Even if he doesn't put that on Trump, I think we're much more likely to see him bounce it back on to Putin. So, we've seen him today, pointing out that whatever Putin said to Trump, he hasn't respected even that very limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure because there were those strikes overnight. So, it's this very difficult dance he's got to do where he's essentially trying to demonstrate to Trump that Putin is not negotiating in good faith, without making Trump feel like a fool or suggesting that he thinks he's being hoodwinked.
Yeah, Zelensky's got to choose his words and his tone so carefully when he deals with President Trump. And meanwhile, the Kremlin, they were very quick yesterday to say that Trump and Putin trust each other. It is worrying, Catherine, for Ukraine and for the rest of Europe that they also say that they intend to move towards the normalization of ties.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that even from the White House statement last night, the fact that possibly only a half of it actually concerned directly the Ukraine track and those negotiations. So much of it was about the normalization of relations. And so much of it indeed was about these great economic opportunities that normalization could yield. And I think that is troubling for both Ukraine and for Europe because obviously it's Russia's holding out all the benefits that Trump could possibly get from this relationship and really quite successfully, I think, keeping alive this bilateral track that shuts out Europe. And potentially, if you look at what the Kremlin was saying about what it wanted, the cessation of all aid, including European aid, you can see that the Kremlin is trying very hard to drive a wedge between the US and Europe.
Yeah.
And it may not be that difficult to do given Trump's feelings about that Europe is not really his concern anymore and that he's got other relationships he needs to tend to.
Yeah. Just if you would, Catherine, have a listen to this. This is Stephen Witkoff, who's, of course, Donald Trump's special envoy, discussing yesterday's phone call.
I thought the call was epic, Jonathan. I thought it was epic, transformational. Those are the sorts of adjectives that I use about this call. The president and President Trump and President Putin were in sync with one another. The call was outcome-oriented. They were talking about how to save lives, how to stop the carnage, and for me, I was proud to be an American sitting there listening to it.
So it was epic. The level of agreement was epic, and it made him proud to be American. And Witkoff also then said, I think in a couple of weeks, we're going to get to it. That is a ceasefire. So lots of good things. Now it's to dot the I's and cross the T's. So upbeat from Steve Witkoff. How on earth, Catherine, do you imagine we could get from where we are now to there?
It's very hard to see. And, Witkoff also said in that same interview, I think that you were just playing there, he also said that what had happened overnight with the hits on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, that wasn't a breach of the peace, and that Putin had given the order 10 minutes after the call. And so those must have been launches that were made before he gave that order. Well, the timetable doesn't really support that. He also claimed that Russia had shot down 7 of its own drones to prevent them from going out. Again, the timetable doesn't look like it. Looks like they're giving, they're giving so much leeway to Putin. And I mean, let's see what happens tonight, whether those strikes happen again, and if they do, what the White House has to say about those. It just seems that they're very willing to overlook what seems glaringly obvious to the rest of us is a lack of good faith.
Yeah, Catherine, great to talk to you as always. Catherine Philp, World Affairs editor at The Times. Now, here with me in the studio, Matthew Luxmore, the Russia and Ukraine reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Hello to you, Matthew. Thanks for coming in.
No problem.
So as we're saying there, Zelensky has to choose his words really carefully, his tone just as carefully. I suppose in Ukraine they're not quite so constrained, the media and others. How's this phone call between Trump and Putin been received there in Ukraine and in Kyiv?
Well, the Ukrainians are very, very concerned about these direct talks between the US and the Russians. They're very, very concerned that, Putin is right now angling for a meeting with Trump, and the two could sit down and hash out Ukraine's fate between them in the course of 5 hours. Zelensky wants to be very involved in any negotiations about the future of his country, but he's really, and it's quite shocking because this is his country that the debates are taking place over. He wants to make sure that, he has a say in this issue, and that the Europeans, who have been supporting him quite consistently all along, unlike the Americans now, of course, are also at the negotiating table. So Zelensky is obviously playing this difficult game where he needs to remain in front of Trump and pushing for his own position to be taken into account.
Yeah, and in plain English, the nagging worry, maybe nagging, with increasing intensity, is that Ukraine's just in the process now of being betrayed by Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Catherine mentioned this delicate dance that Zelensky has to play. I mean, what's kind of overseen at the moment is that Putin also has to play a delicate dance. He is playing this balancing act right now where he's talking about a potential ceasefire with the US side, but at the same time, he wants to drag this out as long as possible. He's playing the long game over Ukraine. He knows that his forces are moving forward. He has absolutely the advantage on the battlefield. Ukraine has manpower issues, and increasingly with the US probably sporadically pulling aid and bringing it back in over the next few months as this plays out, Ukrainian forces are going to be struggling more and more, and the Russians want to take advantage of this. So for Putin, he has to appear to be a peacemaker in conversations with Trump, but he also wants to give the least possible amount that he can in these negotiations without, making concessions to his maximalist demands, which are demands that, essentially amount to Ukraine's capitulation.
And yet after those talks between President Trump and President Putin yesterday, we were told there was at least a limited agreement on a ceasefire when it came to energy installations. A couple of hours after that, energy installations are being struck by Russia. It was not even implemented, despite Moscow saying that Putin had given orders for it to be so.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, this obviously shows the limits of Putin's power. Really? It's he's ruled Russia for a quarter century with what some people would describe as, an iron fist. It's an authoritarian system. He said yesterday, the Kremlin readout after the call said that Putin, during the call with Trump, sent a message out to his, military to stop strikes. Of course, we have to mention both sides have accused each other of violating this ceasefire, of striking each other's energy infrastructure. But I think, for Putin, this is a very, very good price to pay, this agreement that he struck yesterday, because on one hand, as you actually mentioned earlier correctly, this puts an end to very debilitating Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil infrastructure at a time when Russian strikes on Ukraine's infrastructure are far less debilitating because we're now heading slowly into the summer.
Yes.
These are strikes that are much more difficult for Ukraine during the winter, that leave homes without heating, without power, during short days. And at the moment, as we're heading, slowly into summer, the advantage from Russia on these strikes in Ukraine's energy infrastructure go down. So it's actually a good time for Putin to strike a deal like this. And at the same time, it makes him appear as someone who is willing to negotiate a peace.
And when you refer, just briefly, when you refer to the limitations of Vladimir Putin's power, if he sends out an order, no more strikes on energy installations, surely that's it. His word is law.
No, I mean, he is absolutely, the president of the country, and he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. But we'll have to see over coming days if these strikes really do stop. Because if they don't stop, then I think you probably have to question, how sincere, despite what Witkoff says, Putin's promises actually were.
Yeah, it was wise to remember that question. Matthew, thank you so much. Matthew Luxmore from the Wall Street Journal. Now, let's talk to Catherine Belton, who's author of Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and Took on the West, a Russia specialist. Catherine, welcome to the programme.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Hi, Catherine, just give me your thoughts on what we saw before the phone call between Putin and Trump, where we saw Vladimir Putin, it seemed openly gloating about the fact that he calls the shots, including in contact with Trump. He was reminded on a public stage on Russian TV that he was late getting on the phone to Trump, and he just laughed at that reminder. What does that tell us?
Yeah, it shows us that he's really very much enjoying this moment, where he appears to have the leader of the world's most powerful nation basically answering his beck and call. It really is one of these moments for Putin where he thinks he is very close to victory, because we're not seeing much sign yet from Donald Trump that he's going to force Russia to make any concessions. I mean, even after Putin is more or less flat out rejecting this 30-day full ceasefire and trying to replace it with a paltry ceasefire on energy infrastructure, which even then he's not sticking to. And you've still got Donald Trump telling him that they had a good conversation. So, I mean, Putin is really kind of at the top, feels like he's at the top of his game at the moment, but probably he should be a little bit careful, because we don't know when Trump's patience may snap. And very often Putin and other Russians want to overplay their hand. So we'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, interesting thought. Now you have reported, I think, on a Kremlin document to the Kremlin, from the Kremlin, in the Kremlin, saying no peace in Ukraine before 2026. Isn't that right? Can you tell us more?
Yes, we managed to get hold of a document that was drafted by a think tank which works closely with Russia's Federal Security Service, and they were laying out their recommendations for the Russian negotiating position on the war. And they basically said Trump's plan for peace within 100 days is completely impossible to realize, and that there can be no peaceful regulation of this situation till 2026. And that kind of shows you really what the mood is among the hardliners in Russia, that they see themselves as having the upper hand militarily. They see no reason why they should stop at the moment, because they've already driven Ukraine out of most of the Kursk region, which was the key bargaining chip for the Ukrainians in any in adjudicating any territories, and now they've pushed them out of that, and they hope to continue to advance. And we've heard also in this FSB document that Russia wants to create a further carve-up of Ukrainian territory, creating a buffer zone essentially controlled by Russia in Ukraine's northeast on the border with Kursk and some other Russian regions, and also in the south, where there would be a demilitarized zone, which means that basically it would be prey to further Russian attack around the port of Odessa and elsewhere in Ukraine's south. So I don't think there are many who really want to stop right now, particularly when they have the upper hand. And you can see that very clearly in Putin's response to the ceasefire proposal, in saying, yes, but only if you don't give Ukraine any more weapons. And we all know what will happen after 30 days. If Ukraine doesn't have any more weapons, Russia will just keep going.
Right, a very hawkish mood. in Moscow. But of course, Russia also would want to see normalization or something towards normalization between Russia and the wider world, especially, of course, Trump's America. And this talk of an ice hockey match between Russia and America, apparently floated by Vladimir Putin and apparently picked up upon by Donald Trump. It may seem, I don't know, frivolous almost, but it does represent the ambition on the Russian side to restore relations and maybe some willingness to see that happen on Trump's.
Yeah, I mean, this is where they have to get the balance right. I mean, again, what we began with this question, is Putin going to overplay his hand? Because obviously for him, the bigger prize is bringing Russia out of the cold, restoring relations with the US in a way going over Europe's head so that Russia and the US and maybe China will be free to carve up the world between themselves. And this will, and in an era where we've seen the end of liberal democracy, that's his goal, and he wants to drive a wedge in the transatlantic alliance to split the US even further away from Europe, which would be disruptive, of course, to NATO. And then that's a very big win for Putin. But on the other hand, he has very concrete goals in Ukraine. They don't want to give up any of the territory that they've seized. They would like, of course, to keep all the territories they already folded into Russia's constitution, even though they haven't taken all this territory yet. And I think that probably at the moment Putin thinks he can outplay Trump, and we saw this, as you mentioned, yesterday when he was very glibly smirking about being late for a phone call with the American president.
All right, Catherine Belton, Russia specialist, thank you so much for joining us.